You think you know Gene Simmons? The tongue, the fire-breathing, the demon makeup that became an icon, burned into rock and roll history. But here's what they don't tell you. Behind that larger-than-life persona, behind the millions of dollars and the empire built on blood, sweat, and pyrotechnics, there's a man who clawed his way out of absolute poverty. A refugee who couldn't speak English. A kid who watched his mother survive the unthinkable. And right now, the headlines are exploding with stories about Gene that are making even his most devoted fans question everything they thought they knew. So buckle up. Because this isn't just another celebrity story. This is about survival, reinvention, and the price of becoming a living legend. Let's go back to the beginning, before the stadiums, before the money, before Gene Simmons even existed. August 25, 1949. A baby boy is born in Haifa, Israel. His name? Chaim Witz. Not exactly rock star material, right? But here's where it gets heavy. His mother, Florence, had just survived the Holocaust, concentration camps, the systematic murder of her family, the kind of trauma that doesn't just disappear because the war ended. Imagine being a child and growing up with that shadow hanging over your home. Florence rarely talked about it, but Chaim could feel it. The silence that screamed louder than words. The nightmares. The way his mother would stare into nothing, lost in memories too dark to voice. His father? Barely in the picture. Gone before Chaim could form real memories of him. So it was just him and Florence, scraping by in a country still finding its footing after gaining independence. Then came the decision that would change everything. When Chaim was 8 years old, Florence made a choice. They were leaving Israel, immigrating to America. The land of opportunity, they said. Streets paved with gold, they said. But when they arrived in New York City in 1958, reality hit hard. No gold, no easy path. Just another immigrant family struggling to survive in a city that chewed people up and spit them out. They settled in Jackson Heights, Queens. Florence worked as a seamstress, her fingers bleeding from the endless hours at the sewing machine. Chaim didn't speak a word of English. Not one. Can you imagine? Walking into an American school, surrounded by kids, laughing and talking in a language that sounds like complete gibberish. The isolation, the bullying, the loneliness that sits in your chest like a stone. But here's what you need to understand about Chaim Witz, about the boy who would become Gene Simmons. He learned something crucial during those early years, something that would define everything he did later in life. Survival isn't pretty. Survival doesn't care about your feelings. You adapt, or you disappear. So he learned English fast. Obsessively, he consumed American culture like a starving man at a feast. Comic books, movies, television, and music. Oh, the music. Elvis Presley. The Beatles. Suddenly, young Chaim saw a path. A way out. A way to become something more than just another struggling immigrant kid. By the time he hit his teenage years, he'd changed his name. First to Gene Klein, then later the name that would echo through rock history, Gene Simmons. He picked up a guitar, formed bands that went nowhere, played dingy clubs where the audiences numbered in the single digits. But he was learning, watching, calculating. Gene had this almost mathematical mind when it came to business and branding. Even back then, he understood something most struggling musicians didn't. Image mattered, just as much as music. Flash forward to the early 70s. Gene meets a guitarist named Paul Stanley. They start talking, jamming, realizing they share a vision, not just for music, but for spectacle, for something the world had never seen before. Enter the makeup, the costumes, the personas. Gene became the demon. Paul was the star-beard. Ace transformed into the spaceman. Peter became the Catman. And just like that, in 1973, Kiss was born. But success, that didn't come overnight. Their first few albums bombed. Critics absolutely savaged them, calling them talentless, gimmicky, everything except musicians. Radio stations wouldn't touch them. The record label was ready to drop them completely. Gene refused to quit. He and Paul pushed harder, toured relentlessly, perfected their live show into something that bordered on religious experience. The fire breathing, the blood spitting, the platform boots that made them look like demigods descended from Mount Olympus. Then came 1975, the album Alive. Everything changed. Suddenly, Kiss wasn't just a band anymore. They were a phenomenon, a movement. Kids across America were painting their faces, buying the merchandise, lining up for hours just to catch a glimpse of their heroes and Gene. Gene was the mastermind behind it all. While other bands were content just making music, Gene saw the bigger picture. The toys, the comic books, the lunchboxes and action figures. He turned Kiss into the first true entertainment brand in rock history. The money started pouring in. Millions, then tens of millions. Gene became notorious for his business acumen, his work ethic that bordered on inhuman, and his absolute refusal to let anyone take advantage of him financially. But here's where things get complicated. Because with fame and fortune came the lifestyle. And Gene's lifestyle, well, it became legendary for all the right and wrong reasons. He's claimed to have slept with thousands of women. Literally thousands. He kept Polaroids. A whole catalog of conquests, documented like trophies. Some people call it Rockstar excess. Others call it something far less flattering. Gene himself has described it as simply being honest about his desires and the opportunities that fame provided. Then there's Shannon Tweed, Canadian actress and Playboy model. They met in 1983. And despite Gene's notorious reputation and his open admission that monogamy felt unnatural to him, Shannon stuck around. She became his partner, the mother of his children, Nick and Sophie. But they didn't get married. Not for decades. Gene had this thing about marriage, a resistance that ran deep. He'd seen relationships crumble, watched the financial devastation of divorces in Hollywood. He kept Shannon in this perpetual state of partnership without the legal commitment. Imagine being Shannon, loving someone for 28 years, raising his children, building a life together. All while he publicly talks about other women, refuses to marry you, and seems allergic to the very concept of traditional commitment. The strain showed. Reality cameras caught the fights, the tears, the moments when Shannon would confront Gene about his inability to fully commit. And Gene, he'd intellectualize it. Talk about evolution and biology. Use logic to defend what was essentially an emotional cop-out. But here's something interesting. In 2011, something shifted. After 28 years together, Gene finally proposed. They got married in a relatively private ceremony, considering who they were. Maybe Gene finally realized what he had. Maybe the fear of losing Shannon became greater than his fear of marriage. Or maybe, just maybe, the tough-as-nails businessman finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. Their kids. Nick and Sophie grew up in this bizarre world of rock royalty and reality television. The family's lives were broadcast on Gene Simmons' Family Jewels for 7 seasons. The world watched their dysfunction and their love play out in real time. Sophie has been open about the challenges of growing up Simmons. The pressure, the expectations, the constant presence of cameras. But the family survived. Imperfect and messy, sure, but together. Now let's talk about the controversies. Because oh boy, Gene Simmons knows how to stir up trouble with his mouth almost as well as he does with his music. Over the years, he's made comments that range from politically incorrect to downright inflammatory. His statements about depression and suicide sparked massive backlash in 2014. Gene essentially said that people struggling with depression should seek help or face consequences. But his delivery was harsh, lacking empathy. The rock community came down on him hard. Nikki Sixx from mortality crew, who'd struggled with addiction and mental health himself, publicly called Gene out. Gene eventually apologized. But the damage was done. It revealed a side of him that many found cold, calculating, maybe too practical for his own good. Then there's the politics. Gene's been vocal about his support for various political causes and figures, often alienating portions of his fan base. He's unapologetically capitalistic, pro-business to a fault. He's made statements about immigration that seem almost ironic, considering his own background as an immigrant who barely spoke English when he arrived in America. The cognitive dissonance is startling. How does someone who literally lived the immigrant success story sometimes seem to lack empathy for others, walking that same difficult path? It's a question that's plagued Gene's public image for years. Throughout all of this, KISS continued. Lineup changes happened. Ace and Peter left, came back, left again. The drama behind the scenes could fill volumes. Lawsuits, bitter public feuds. Former bandmates accusing Gene and Paul of greed and manipulation. But KISS kept touring, kept making money, became one of the highest-grossing touring acts in history. Gene's business empire expanded beyond music. Real estate, restaurants, licensing deals that put the KISS brand on everything from caskets to condoms. He wasn't kidding when he said he'd merchandise anything that could be merc, ENDISED. Critics continued to dismiss KISS as a gimmick, a triumph of marketing over musicianship. Gene didn't care. He'd smile that famous smile, count his money, and keep building his empire. But recently, things have been changing. The headlines that are breaking now are telling a different story. KISS announced their final tour. The end of the Road World Tour was supposed to be the grand farewell. 50 years of rock and roll spectacle coming to a close. Fans around the world mourned. They bought tickets. They prepared for one last chance to see their heroes in makeup and platforms. But here's what's making news now. Gene's been opening up in ways he never has before. Interviews where he's letting the mask slip. Not the demon makeup, the other mask. The one he's worn his entire life. The armor of confidence and bravado that's protected him from vulnerability. He's been talking about mortality, about legacy, about the weight of creating something that outlived its creators. In recent interviews, Gene's shown something almost unheard of from him. Introspection. Maybe even regret. He's acknowledged mistakes. The way he treated women. The ego that pushed people away. The single-minded pursuit of success that cost him friendships and peace of mind. It's not a full confession or a redemption arc scripted by Hollywood. It's just honesty. Raw and uncomfortable. But here's the real story beneath all the headlines. Gene Simmons, the character, is preparing to die. The demon is hanging up his platform boots. But Chaim Witz, that scared immigrant kid from Israel who learned to survive in America by becoming someone else entirely. He's still here, still processing, still trying to figure out what comes next. That's the breaking news that matters. Not another controversy or business deal, but the human reality that even the most larger-than-life figures eventually have to confront their own mortality and legacy. What will Gene be remembered for? The music? The business empire? The controversies and the complicated personal relationships? All of it, probably. Legacy is messy. It's never just one thing. What we're witnessing now is the closing chapter of one of rock's most fascinating stories. A Holocaust survivor's son who turned himself into a demon and conquered the world. A businessman who saw opportunity where others saw limitations. A man who built walls around his heart and finally, maybe too late, or maybe just in time, let someone truly in. The headlines will keep coming. Gene Simmons doesn't do quiet exits. But beneath the spectacle and the publicity, there's just a man, aging, reflecting, trying to make peace with the choices that defined his life. And maybe that's the most human thing about Gene Simmons. For all his claims of being different, of being superhuman, of being the demon in the end, he's just like everyone else, wondering if it was worth it, hoping he didn't waste the precious time he had. Grateful for the people who stuck around despite everything. The curtain is falling. The makeup is coming off. And beneath it all, we're left with a story that's quintessentially American. An immigrant kid who survived, adapted, and conquered. Who made mistakes and built monuments. Who hurt people and created joy for millions. Gene Simmons is breaking headlines one last time. Not because of scandal or controversy, but because we're watching a legend learn to be human again. And that might be the most compelling act of his entire career. So what do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that go beyond the headlines and dig into the real human drama behind the legends, hit that subscribe button and join the Luminoir family. We're just getting started.